and welcome back to A Little Bit Forward. This is the show where we don't really offer answers. We just provide you with some additional questions. Each episode is only a few minutes long. It introduces a single idea and then leaves you with 5 minutes of silence. You need to explore that and think through that in your own time. Today, I want to talk to you about biases. And we have a general belief that biases are bad. And this comes up a lot in my work around kind of decision-making and the negative impacts potentially that biases have. But I was reading an article recently by someone I follow closely, Dr. Tom Stafford, who runs a great blog on Substack called Reasonable People. And this article was called Good Biases. And it really kind of reframed my thinking about biases and the role that they play, and potentially the positive role that they play. So within this article, he talks about this concept called signal detection theory. And he uses the example of a radar operator, and he's trying to determine whether something that appears on the radar, is it a hostile aircraft or not? And if he positively identifies a hostile aircraft, that's really good, because then they can potentially shoot the hostile aircraft down. But also, you don't want to identify something that's not a hostile aircraft as a hostile aircraft. So there is both a positive result if you can correctly identify as being true or not true. But there's also the problem that you could be wrong, and that you could inadvertently identify something that isn't a hostile aircraft as being hostile, or also importantly, misidentify something that as a hostile aircraft, that is a hostile aircraft that isn't. I think I've got all that right. Now, the repercussions of that can be catastrophic if the hostile aircraft gets through your defense systems and launches a missile or an attack and people die. That is the consequences of a false negative. And a false positive also has consequences. You launch a missile at, a stray seagull. One of the things he says, though, in such a situation, we do have a bias. And in fact, we are biased in a way that limits the negative impacts of possible future events. That because the consequences of a false negative are so high, that it actually makes more sense to be biased towards a false positive. And this is interesting because I can understand that, like when we talk about biases, we talk about the decision-making process. But what this is really about is the decision-making outcome and the consequences about decisions. Now, I don't think that this excuses all biases. I think sometimes the biases is based on unverified beliefs about consequences. So when we talk about things like racial biases, gender biases, these are probably or sometimes based on outdated and unfounded beliefs about negative consequences associated with race or gender. But I do think at the same time, this reframing of understanding that some biases are positive is actually a really powerful one. This also led me to start thinking about my own biases. One of my favorite biases, which I love to bring up in my talks, is the I'm not biased bias. The I'm not biased bias says that, yeah, I understand that there are biases out in the world and that people are biased, but I'm just less biased than everybody else. But of course, we can't all be less biased than everybody else, because somebody on average would have to be more biased. And so this also then leads to the question about, well, let's just assume that at least in some areas you are more biased than average. And what might those biases be? And for myself, I came to the conclusion that one of my areas where I'm probably more biased than average is what they call the fairness bias. I actually have a belief that the world is fairer than it probably really is. And so this does lead to sometimes behaviors where you can get taken advantage of, or you get thoroughly disappointed when other people get taken advantage of as well. But possibly with some of these biases, as much as there is a negative outcome of the false belief that the world is fairer than it really is, it could also possibly be that that is a superior outcome. The false belief in fairness is actually a superior outcome than the alternative, which is a false belief that the world is inherently unfair. So this is the question I want to leave you with. I want you actually to think about your own biases. We all have them, even if we believe that in some cases our biases are not as strong as others, but we all have them. In this case, I want you to think about, what is the bias where you are more biased than average. But I also want you to think about it in terms of this concept of intended outcomes. Why is it that you hold that bias, and what might be the positive outcome of holding it rather than looking at it through the lens of negativity, which we normally see? All right, let me give you 5 minutes of silence to think through that. Look forward to seeing you on another episode.